Hi, I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. Such a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. Um, Maybe you can kick off with a brief introduction to this incredibly unique whirlwind of a film, Flux Gourmet. What can audiences expect if they watch it?
Expect a bit of noise, perhaps, a bit of squabbling. Hopefully, maybe a different perspective on things that would normally be funny in a film, such as stomach issues. That was quite a big motivation for making the film. But yeah, I think if you're expecting a plot or character arc and so on, maybe you should see something else.
And I believe you're actually in a sonic culinary band yourself. Is that true? And is that kind of where the inspiration for the film came from?
Well, I was. I'm not now. I was in something quite similar. But yeah, we definitely took elements of what we did, and I spoke to the other two members, Tim Kirby, Colin Fletcher, and showed them the script and warned them that we're not going to look good in this film, and they were very easygoing about it all and gave it their blessing.
And how did that all come about originally? How did that band occur, and what kind of things were you doing when you were doing it?
Pretty similar, really. We were cooking food and documenting. So we were not performing with food. We'd actually cook the meal and eat it afterwards. And we treat the sound the same way you treat food. You chop. We were using 1/4-inch tape back then. This is 1996. Chopping the tape, processing it, layering it, mixing it. So really just taking a very domestic activity for Western ears and transforming it, heightening it, and maybe... I think what was interesting for me with both music and film was people who would make you listen again. Like Alan Splett with David Lynch, you listen to The Radiator in a different way afterwards. People like Alvin Lucia, Luke Ferrari, they were just, yeah, they would present things that you always hear, but suddenly you're hearing them differently.
And some of the more extreme elements we see in the film, was any of that based in your experience, or is some of that, you've imagined the more extreme parts?
Well, there's a whole tradition when it comes to bodily fluids, especially excrement and so on. It goes from the Viennese actionists, people like Kurt Klenn, Otto Mühl, Hermann Nietzsche, to Carolee Schneemann, to G.G. Allen, who was a lot more thuggish in the way he did these things, or Schimpflug in Switzerland, I think, if I pronounce them correctly. And even people like Cozy Fanny Tutti from when she was in Throbbing Gristle. So yeah, I was interested in that whole idea of that very confrontational aspect of doing these things, but connecting it to something that opens up a conversation, perhaps, about the bowels and the dysfunctional nature of the bowels, and autoimmune issues, and especially things like Crohn's, celiac disease, irritable bowel syndrome. And I think just in a way, the hope, this is not the main aim of the film, but I think within all this, the hope that maybe people can talk about it without any kind of stigma or shame. I mean, there's a way of talking about these things without being vulgar.
And do you find that interesting, actually, when you really think about it, that the taboos that are there, whether that's in society or whether that's what we can show on screen, aren't actually, people are more sort of shocked by, menstrual blood being shown on screen than they are like incredibly violent, gory, murders, for example. So is there something there in our own perceptions of what is taboo, and still some kind of progress that needs to be made in terms of knocking some of those down?
I would say that. I mean, I have direct experience with what you mentioned. My previous film had someone licking menstrual blood, and we wouldn't have got an R rating had they kept the shot in. It would have been an NC-17, so we had to cut that shot. And that was exactly what you mentioned. It's just so odd when you can show pretty hardcore violence and misogyny, but you can't show someone licking menstrual blood. And I think what it is, I completely respect an individual who says, who knows someone's sexual background. So I would never be one to judge someone for walking out and finding it offensive. What I do find odd is this collective attitude, especially when it comes from censorship board or from filmmaking. That's when I have an issue, that there is this double standard where violence, no one has ever called me out on the violence in my films. And there's not much violence in my films, but no one has ever called me out on that. I've always been called out on the sex, always. Why do you have to have that? Why is it necessary? And I'm mostly showing human pleasure. It might be not vanilla heteronormative sex, but it is consensual adults, and I'm always getting told off for it. So I don't know. It's what was I going to mention? It's just interesting how pleasure is always seen as threatening. I remember growing up in the 80s when rave culture was beginning. I was too young to dance. I didn't go out. I was still 15 or something, and but I remember the tabloid headlines calling people like Mark Moore the devil. It's just bizarre to think about it now. So yeah, it's always been interesting how hedonism and pleasure has been so much more threatening and offensive than violence, which to me is horrible. That shouldn't be part of the human experience. But again, I don't want to open a can of worms. That I think somehow the Me Too movement has opened a side door here. Where the Me Too movement was long overdue, completely necessary. But there was some puritanical souls who used that as an excuse to hinder the representation of desire on screen. And I think the good thing that's come out of Me Too is you have intimacy coordinators, and I think that is a necessary thing. I think with the best will in the world, things can go wrong. Misunderstandings happen. I think you do need these things to be regulated, coordinated. But to see desire on screen, some people are still objecting to it. And again, if it's a personal objection, I respect that. But desire is part of human life, even if you're celibate. I think it's there in our heads. It's so much part of the human experience. And to say, no one says we don't want to see violence in films because of a spike in knife crime. So I know what I say is not very popular these days, but that's my personal opinion.
And I was going to ask as well, do you see a through line between the different films you've made and how each one might be an evolution of the last? Or thinking about Distortion of Sound, which you had Barbarian Sound Studio, or the way you create these very idiosyncratic worlds that once you sort of become involved in the film just feel completely real, and like very kind of self-contained. So do you see a link between your different films and how they follow on from each other?
Not really. I mean, I think the only link is they're made by one person, and I think that just happens when you write and direct. If I think of other writer-directors, there is that. It's just inherent. It's just the nature of one person being behind it all. But then again, I have to be careful how I say that, because it is a collaboration. You're collaborating with your heads of department. You're collaborating with your actors. When I started, I didn't know. You don't even know if you're going to make a second film. I think all I know is my taste. That's all I know. I don't know what I'm going to explore, how I'm going to explore it. It's only in hindsight you can find links, perhaps. So it's not by design. No, not really.
And thinking of, you know, the cast you put together in this film, such a wonderful collection of actors, and, you know, particularly seeing Gwendoline Christie and Asa Butterfield, perhaps in roles we wouldn't expect to see them in, particularly Gwendoline in these amazing outfits, and, you know, after seeing her in Game of Thrones, for example. So how did you decide on your cast, and how did you work with them to achieve a very specific vision?
Well, it's a mixture of knowing people already. So I knew Gwendoline, Richard, who played Dr. Glock. I knew Fatma, of course. Ariane Laberde, who played Lamina, I knew her socially. Others, like Asa, I'd never met him before. That was very much Shaheen's work. But I should add that Shaheen did a lot of work on this film that you don't see because of the pandemic. It was a revolving door of actors. Pretty much all the actors at one point dropped out or dropped back in, or we got replacement actors. So I really think she deserves a lot of credit for that film. So once it's cast, some of it, there was a shorthand because you know the actors already. Fatma, we've done 5 films together, so there is she kind of knows the tone and the rhythm. But even then, there's a line in the film where she lies about having gone to a comprehensive school. I was going to say, yeah. So Fatma, I had to explain this British thing with public schools that in Britain you hide the fact you went to a public school. I mean, I should put my hands up and say I went to one, shamefully. But I've been in talks with people who basically deny that and pretend otherwise, which is very funny. So she was kind of like, why would you hide it? So, well, you know, it's a complicated thing in this country. So certain things which are very British, she I had to kind of talk her through it. But otherwise, I think also with Fatma, a lot of it is music. You play some music on set, especially for the performances, and she's finding this little zone she can enter. Someone like Gwendoline Christie, we have similar taste in film and music, so she got so many of the things I was talking about.
And I guess it's almost at the end of our time now, but, you know, what do you want people to feel or take away from watching the film? Because there's so much humor in it, but there's also a sweetness and the things you were mentioning there at the beginning about, you know, helping people maybe accept kind of, you know, these bodily things that are completely natural that they have to deal with, and there's a lot of social stigma around. And the fact that you really immerse people in this world, and it is very visceral, which I guess can be divisive for people who watch your films. But, you know, what do you think sort of the core themes are, and what do you think people take away?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. After Jean-Luc Godard died, I was just thinking about his films that opened up the idea of film being more like, this sounds a bit pretentious, but being like discourse. It's not about a plot, a character arc. It's about ideas. So there are many things in there to do with creativity, with ego, with deceit, the nature of being in a gang and a band and so on, and shock value, and also, yeah, this idea of even creativity in terms of being a hack. You know, that most of us have to do hack work, unless you're rich. You know, I'm not poor, I'm middle class, but I can't survive making films. I have to do other jobs. And I was kind of losing the stigma there as well. But there's a lot of stigma about being a hack in the industry. People are always making fun of you if you do something for hire. I work for hire, and I'm proud of it. And I think people shouldn't be shamed into not doing it. But yeah, I mean, the stomach was my number one thing. I think I just, again, in the right context, I think some of the symptoms, you know, the flatulence and so on, I think in a comedy, in the right moment, it can be very funny, of course. But if it's someone that can't control it, and it's chronic, and it completely hinders their social life, that shouldn't be funny. And I think you can hopefully look at it in a way that opens up a conversation. I think there are ways to talk about it without being vulgar. I think, but yeah, I think again, I think a film can't cure celiac disease. It can't cure irritable bowel syndrome, but a lot of the anxiety around it is the social side, that you can't talk about it, that you have to make an excuse for not going out, or that you have to kind of again stand back from someone in a corner somewhere. And I think if you can say why you feel this way, or or whatever, I don't know. I think that's, for me, the taboos that were being broken, the interesting ones were the ones that led to some kind of sexual liberation or social liberation. So I was never into taboo when it came to violence. That's just, it's always bad. But if I think of Warhol and Morrissey with gay rights, trans rights, the same with Fassbinder as well. If I think of Michaela Cole with her work with menstruation, they really opened up something that shouldn't be taboo.
And can you quickly tell us what you might work on next after you've seen this?
I'm actually writing for hire at the moment. That's my main work. I've got 3 scripts I'm working on, so that's going to take up quite a lot of time. I was a bit burnt out from making Flux. It was a tough one. So I'm working from home. I'm writing scripts for other people. I'm not going to direct them. But yeah, it's my moonlighting job, which I quite enjoy.
Amazing.
So there's nothing immediate on the horizon. No.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with us, and can't wait for everyone else to get an opportunity to see Flux Gourmet. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Nice to chat to you.